Welcome to the Chat Lounge, Dr. Tsering. So let's start with a recent finding by the United Nations World Meteorological Organization in its annual bulletin published ahead of the International Day of Clean Air for Blue Skies, which falls on September 7th every year. The agency said the level of health damaging nanoparticles known as PM2.5 in the air declined in China last year and stood actually below global average. So, does the finding come in line with your observation?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. I've been visiting China since 2006, and I've been impressed with the way that the government of China and the people really have tackled air pollution. So the findings are very much in line with my observation. You know, air pollution is one of the three planetary crises we face, and air pollution has become really an issue of global concern because we're finding that, at least in our region, 9 out of 10 people breathe unsafe air. And we can see the impacts for children under 15. There's some statistics that say as many as 93% of children under the age of 15 breathe air that is so polluted it risks not only their health, but their development.
Right. You just
Yes.
mentioned you first came to China in 2010. Am I correct?
2006, yes.
Oh, sorry, 2006. So when was your last time visit China then?
August in 2023. And what I've seen, I mean, if we can see, I mean, when I first came to China, Beijing had already initiated a really intense air pollution control program. And over the last 2 decades, we've been working very closely with the Beijing metropolitan authorities. And we've seen how they've reduced air pollution, sort of the heavily polluted days of particulate 2.5. And then we did a review UNEP of 20 years air pollution control in Beijing. And we looked at many of the lessons that we've learned to serve as examples for best practice. And a few lessons stand out. I mean, one of the lessons was just the level of investment that Beijing did in terms of the resources that was needed. Another aspect was they did source apportionment. So they knew exactly where the emissions were coming from. And then they had these mobile enforcement units. So they were in real time monitoring air pollution.
Right. You mentioned a lot of measures the government has taken over the past 20 decades actually. So then, what would you say was the key turning points or policies that marked this transformation? What would you
I mean,
value most?
it was really clear the energy source and
All right.
looking at reducing coal. It was also taking steel mills, and really transforming it into an outdoor Olympic Games. There was a lot of communication talking about bringing back blue skies, and of course the electric mobility, looking at the even and uneven, number plates that came in, but the mobile enforcement units, and the science and the evidence in terms of where the emission came from. So it was really science, it was policy, it was regulation, and it was working with all actors in Beijing.
And all those measures taken, what would you say that impressed you most if you have to choose one or two of them?
I think the measure that impressed me the most was taking the science and the mobile enforcement units and just the commitment to look at the numbers and to bring back blue skies. I mean, it was decades in the making, and it was also the link that being developed meant you had blue skies because it was a very difficult transition with difficulty at the personal level.
How difficult was it? Do we, have any precedent? I understand. Actually, cities like London has have experiences similar, pollution before, right? In the 1960s, if my memory serves me correctly.
I think I think with air pollution, when I first went to Beijing, you could actually see days where the air pollution was so strong that you could smell it. You didn't see blue skies. You could see days where school children had difficulty going to school. Um,
Right.
so it was quite visible and demonstrable. But the difficulty with air pollution is it's just not one measure. It's a series of measures, and and this is where many other countries, they're trying to learn from Beijing to see what are the lessons that they can take from Beijing. Having regulation, having accountability from mayors, that is also extremely important.
Actually, the core of traditional Chinese culture, both Confucianism and Taoism, is harmony between man and nature. And in the early days of the People's Republic, the government carried out projects such as the Shelter Belt Forest Project in 3 North region, also known as the Green Great Wall. Not sure if you've heard of it, to protect the environment. But due to the economic difficulties China faced in the early years, the country's environmental policy experienced some evolvement from economy centered in its early industrialization period to its current emphasis on ecological civilization. And globally, when it comes to reforestation, the country registered the highest increase in forest coverage from 1990 to 2020. And among the 230 plus countries and territories covered by the FAO Global Forest Resources Assessment, China stands out in terms of its high and consistent increase in forest coverage from during that period. So, wondering what's the significance of this achievement in your eyes?
When you can't over state the importance of forests. So you look at forests that support livelihoods, food production, critical ecosystems. And so when forests are degraded, the ability to purify air and water declines. It impacts air and water quality. And you think about forests, they sequester carbon dioxide emissions, but when they're deforested, they release carbon dioxide emissions. So the 24% forest coverage, and you can see that the forest cover and the forest stock and volume has been growing in China over the last 30 years. And China accounts now for more than 25% of the world's new green areas. I think China's efforts to expand its forest area and improve forest quality have improved the ecosystem carbon sink. And this is going to be really important when China looks at achieving its climate goals as well as combating nature and sort of pollution. At a personal level, I had really the opportunity to travel, and I visited, and I don't know if I'd say it well, the Bar Forest. And it was about and what I found there was just in the really extreme climates, there was an ability to really bring back forests, and they had a beautiful museum where you saw people are really, really looking at how they monitored forest fires and the sacrifices that people made at a personal level to to protect forests, and that's why the Bar Afforestation Community, UNEP, awarded a Champions of the Earth in 2017, and it was in the category of inspiration and action. So you saw a barren area in the 50s due to logging. You saw multiple generation of foresters and, just the individuals. You saw forests supply clean water to Beijing and Tianjin and a source of green economic growth. So really very, very visible.
Right. I understand your home country actually has a very, big coverage of forest, right? So compared with your home country, how are we doing right now?
My home country, Bhutan, has put in its constitution that we have to maintain 60% of forests for all times to come. So it's been currently we have 72% forest cover, but this has been a very, very strong commitment. But of
Yeah, that's
course,
a very high coverage rate.
yes. And I think I also it's one of the first countries that are carbon neutral. So I think again, when countries make these ambitious commitments, there's value not only to them but really to the ecosystems.
Indeed. Renewable energy and emissions reduction. Let's talk a little bit about that. You've already obviously touched upon that, but China has invested heavily in renewable energy and is now a global leader in solar and wind power. So, how do you assess the impact of these developments on China's carbon emissions? And what further steps do you think are really needed to meet international climate goals, such as the Paris Agreement for China?
I mean, China's rapid growth and investment in renewable energy has been impressive, particularly solar and wind. And it's a really important part in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions for China in meeting its national climate pledge, including carbon neutrality. But when you think of China, it's really a global leader in the renewable energy capacity, accounting for more than three-fourths of global solar panel production. But fossil fuels are still a significant part of China's energy system. The expansion of solar and wind energy has helped reduce reliance on coal, and China's made a commitment to no longer build overseas coal plants. But when you think of the climate goals, we're really looking at needing to phase down, uh, you know, really coal reliance, expanding green technology, stronger policy enforcement. And again, to do this, when we talk about a just transition, so you're still thinking about jobs, you're thinking about livelihoods, and we're thinking about sustaining efforts across all sectors of the economy. And you're talking about decarbonization investments, which are very heavy. You're talking about scaling up large scale battery storage systems. So we tackle the intermittency of solar and wind energy. We need to improve transmission infrastructure. We need to promote demand side management to balance renewable energy supply and demand. And I think
Right.
and China's also
Yeah,
working
continue, please.
very, very much in, different parts of the world. And you start to think about electric mobility. Um, so many parts of the world. I mean, you start to look at the investment that China has made in electric mobility. And so this really is an opportunity, not only for China, to sort of become a leader sort of in renewable energy, but it's also an opportunity for China to put forward an ambitious new pledge at the global level.
And then, do you think China's now is doing or has been too ambitious, or have we done enough in that regard?
I think the scale of ambition that China had in solar with meeting three-fourths of the world's, solar production is exactly the kind of ambition that the world was going to need to bring down solar costs, solar energy
All right.
costs. And we look forward to continued ambition from China.
All right. Another important aspect when it comes to environment protection is the conservation of biodiversity. It's a major goal, obviously, in building an ecological civilization. So, can you tell us some any successful project or challenges you've noticed China has faced in protecting endangered species and restoring natural habitats?
So the Shanshui initiative, it's really sort of a very impressive example of when we call the decade for ecosystem restoration. And what it does is when at the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, we named the initiative as one of the global restoration flagships. And what this project did was it was launched in 2010. It took really a systematic approach to restoration. It did national land use plans, it worked at landscape and watershed scale. It took agricultural urban areas, it took natural ecosystems, and it boosted multiple local industries. And so what it did was 2 million hectares were restored already, and they plan to restore 10 million hectares by 2030. So that really is really impressive. Uh, Also, China officially established the first batch of 5 national parks in 2021, including and I will pronounce it badly, Sanjianyuan National Park and the
Perfectly.
China Pan
Sanjiangyuan, right.
and the Giant Panda National Park here, really to talk about, a mega biodiversity species to strengthen biodiversity protection. And here again, it's 230,000 square kilometers. So really the sort of the approach to strengthen national parks, number of flagship species, increased diversity. And here the park system protects over 80% of wildlife species and the habitats. So again, extremely impressive.
Actually, China cannot achieve all those or make those accomplishments only by itself. Actually, the country made the progress, like you just mentioned, with the help from and collaboration with international organizations like UNEP. And I understand in late 2021, China announced an initiative, to establish the Kunming Biodiversity Fund, and taking the lead by investing 1.5 billion yuan, or that's around over 200 million US dollars during a meeting of the Conference of the Practices to the excuse me, to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and which is also known as COP15, held in Kunming. And it was announced the fund would be used to support biodiversity protection in developing countries. So, what's the implication of such a move?
So, China served, with the Convention on Biological Diversity, they have what you call Conference of Parties. So China was the president of the 15th Conference of Parties to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And like you said, the Kunming Biodiversity Fund was about 233 million. And what it
Right.
does is the global biodiversity framework really is a shared blueprint to look at how you halt and reverse loss of biodiversity. And so what this with the global biodiversity framework shows us is really how do we support countries leverage resources to close sort of what you call the gap for funding nature. And you're looking at needing protected areas. We're needing to redirect finance for protection. We're talking about needing, and we had this a target of 30 by 30 by 30, and basically we're talking about increasing resources for biodiversity, and we're also talking about, in addition to protected areas, all the measures to address biodiversity through agriculture, through nutrient waste. And there's a lot of funds in order to help countries prepare the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. So when they work with an economic development plan, this strategy, National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plan, is a part of it. And you think, I mean, in China, you think about the flagship species, the Yangtze finless porpoise, which increased, um, 29.4% in 2022. You talk about the poor deer, you talk about the wild panda that now stands at around 1900. So this Kunming Biodiversity Fund also helps the world provide resources for conservation of tiger habitats, for the snow leopard. It also helps country put aside protected areas, both terrestrial and marine protected areas. So the contribution by China in getting a global framework was significant, but also the fund to actually help countries on the ground
Mm,
that allows the implementation of this framework.
right. But there are a lot of species are in danger. So I'm not quite sure if this 200 or 230 plus million US dollars is actually sufficient. Or does UNEP expect China to do more in this regard?
So a lot of the initial investments when so if China works with a country to help them develop a national strategy and action plan, what actually also
Mm,
happens, and there's a lot of work that's looking at nature related sort of disclosures, so that companies when they work, they're looking at how they impact the loss of biodiversity. You're giving countries the tools and the skills to then start, because a lot of the investments still come from domestic budgets. So this is very catalytic
mm,
that will drive the resources. And we're looking forward to the global community continuing this trend of um, very much supporting the Kunming Biodiversity Fund.
mm. All right. And let's talk a little bit about the challenges ahead. China obviously aims to reach its carbon emission peak before 2030 and become carbon neutral before 2060. So, your perception of the plan, which is regarded a bit too ambitious by some observers, what do you think?
I mean, they're really two levels. So when we think of the commitments from China, they're very much welcomed, because if we are going to stay within a 1.5-degree warming world, we need all countries to increase ambition to tackle the climate crisis. So of course, China plays a really critical role in closing the emission gap. We need China to transition to a green low carbon economy. And this is one of the most fundamental elements that was laid out in the climate goals set down in the Paris Agreement. We're talking about the shift to renewable energy, and this is really a positive sign for China, because between 2019 to 2024, China will account for 40% of global renewable capacity expansion. The area where we're looking to China's leadership, the UN Secretary General Mr. Antonio Guterres has repeatedly called for no new coal plants, and we're looking at every country reducing the coal share in the energy mix. But when we think of the China's income level, the economic structure, the energy mix, economic growth, achieving the goals will require continued dedicated effort and determination. And I think what is going to be really important is in the transition that we still think about jobs, we think about employment, we think about livelihoods, we think about poverty reduction, so that the cost of the change in the energy mix does not fall upon a certain segment of the population.
Right. And actually, last year, China participated in the international initiative Buildings Breakthrough, which aims to decarbonize the building sector. So, to what extent would such a move help the country meet its emission targets in time?
So when you think about, you really think about the buildings breakthrough. Um, one of the issues that's really come about with buildings is it's an area where there's really been very, very little recognition of construction in most countries, nationally determined contributions. But if you start to think about the role buildings and construction play in our economy for prosperity and well-being, we're talking about needing to green and improve resilience of the sector. And the buildings and construction sector represent 37% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And and also we start when you think about the sector, it's a major consumer of natural resources. So we're talking about and you increase the buildings and construction sector, we will increase the greenhouse gas
Mm,
emissions needed to double. So we're saying, okay, if you decarbonize buildings, firstly, there's a boost for business and jobs because this is new skills. The built
yeah,
environment contributes 11 to 13% of global GDP, 7% of global employment. What does efficient buildings mean? Efficient buildings mean you'll use less heat when it's cold, and you use less air conditioners, when it's hot. And I mean, the whole idea of extreme heat with climate change and the cooling sector really is going to become both a significant challenge or a significant opportunity. So we're looking at investment opportunities in the building sector in emerging markets. Some estimates 24.7 trillion by 2030. Again, if you take a dollar
mm,
and you retrofit efficient measures, you create, they say, 9 to 30 jobs. So, what the Buildings Breakthrough did was it brought together 29 countries, 32 global partners, and really committed to a worldwide near zero emission for resilient buildings. So, we now have a
right.
global alliance for buildings and construction. So when you start to think about, you know, this transition, it's not only new investments, it's also looking at how the consumption and production, the sustainable consumption and production, and it's also looking at behavioral. Like in many countries, if you have a three-bedroom apartment, and people look at the energy use, and then they start to do trends, and then they start to tell residents, your neighbor has an energy bill a third less than yours. Can you start to review how you utilize energy? So it's retrofitting,
Mm,
it's looking at buildings and construction, but it's very much behavioral, and we're going to need all these changes if we're going to move forward to stay within a 1.5-degree warming world.
mm. It sounds very promising, but obviously it would come with a lot of challenges. So, do we have any other examples to follow in other parts of the world then?
I mean, you talked about London and air pollution. We when we start to look at, I mean, and if you start to
I mean,
look at,
in this construction field, make it more, environmentally friendly,
so if you think of Eastern Europe, I mean, the old boilers used for the buildings were massively
right?
converted into district energy systems. And China is also doing that. I mean, a lot of this that
Uh,
China is doing, but it's really looking at that, infrastructure and investment. It's what China did in Shanghai with
mm,
solar rooftop panels. Um, so a lot of these changes and these charges, there are a lot of really good pilots. Often they're not at the scale that's needed for the transformation.
right. And also in January, it seems we got a lot of plans. The Chinese government issued an opinion on developing a beautiful China new targets. New targets include electric vehicles making up 45% of new car sales by 2027, 60% of zero waste cities by 2027, and by 2035, all cities should be zero waste, and a beautiful countryside should basically be realized. So, what do you think of those targets?
I think, the clean energy transition, moving to zero waste, you know, bolstering nature are really key to achieving shared goals on the environment. Um, when we look at these targets, I mean, if you talk about, um, zero waste, you're really talking about sustainably using resources and resource efficiency, putting them back in the cycle. When China had, started to work on food loss, food waste, you really talked about the efficiency in utilizing scarce resources. Because when you do agriculture, you think of the water used, you think of the energy used. So all these targets can bring benefits to our health, can reduce emissions, and can really ensure that cities are livable and sustainable. You think
Mhm.
about waste management really is going to be fundamental to shift to circular economy where we make the most of precious resources. The global transition to circularity can save us, can save us resources, can create jobs. And I think we have to think of, the take, make, waste. That model doesn't apply to scarce resources. So I think this vision that's outlined, I think is very, very promising.
Yeah, you said it's very promising, but some people would doubt whether we can achieve that because, back in just a couple of years ago during the pandemic, there were there's a lot of restart of coal-fired plants in China. So there are some doubts over China's ability to achieve goals. It's zero waste by all cities should be zero waste by 2035. Is it too, again, too ambitious?
So we're really starting to think about if you can quantify the environmental aim and you provide a clear timeline. So what does zero waste mean? It means that we're able to compost, you know, food waste. Um, it looks like we recycle, we manufacture, and we do product design in a way that bottles can be reused. So you really minimize, what really goes to waste. This, like you said, is not easy. It's going to need a whole of government, a whole of economy approach. But I mean, we don't really have a choice. We don't have resources. We have we have global warming. Um, so I think China's targets and roadmaps to achieve zero waste cities, electrify transport, enhance natural areas is what the world is going to need to journey to pollution-free planet and climate stability. So we are counting on your success.
Right. Okay, last but not least, as China approaches its centenary in 2049, what are the main environmental challenges and opportunities it faces in achieving its vision of an ecological civilization? How may UN environment and China cooperate during this process then?
So I think China will be facing the challenge of seeking sustainable growth while reducing pressure on the environment. Economic growth and living in harmony with nature. So really, that's the balance. We talk about the triple planetary crises, and this is the crises of climate change, loss of nature, and pollution. And China has worked aggressively to address each of them and has been critical to progress on all accounts. I attend the China Council for International Cooperation and Development annually, and we see China's engagement on international environmental policy in action. They work to discuss China's policy, but they work with other countries. And you start to think of China taking a leadership role, whether it's on the Ramsar Wetland Convention, whether it's on the Convention to Combat Desertification, whether it's a convention on biological diversity. And so you see, very, very ambitious national targets. You see working with the global community to set these global frameworks. And so, and you also see successes. Like you've asked me, what has been successful, in the recent decade? if you think of successes at scale, a lot of it comes from China. And so China can share stories and lessons learned together with other countries in Asia Pacific. And I think when UNEP did a review of China's air pollution in Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei, what we did was we're really recording the lessons learned and examples for other countries. And so the UNEP executive director is a vice chairperson of the China Council for International Cooperation, Environment and
Mm,
Development. And we've worked over the last 30 years together. And so we very much count on the Ministry of Ecology and Environment as a very strong partner of the UN Environment Program.
right. And you said China could share its success stories with other developing countries. So, if you're asked to choose one of them, or if you're asked to share one of them with others, what would you choose?
I'd really start to look at, I mean, some of the work on air pollution, because this is an
Right.
area um, really in terms of science, policy, enforcement, and in terms of, monitoring. The other area would be, I mean, really areas where you've taken policies, food loss and food waste would be one. Whereas they've really gone to restaurants and said, you know, China, the kind of investments that China does often is quite daunting when other countries look at, how they can replicate some of the best practices. But when you start to look at whether it's science, policy, enforcement, implementation, and going to scale, uh, that really is quite remarkable.
This is CGTN Radio. Hear the difference.